integrated into the operator itself. Wait, so yeah, so let me take my words back. So let me document what can be done in R1, right? And how it would be used, or how a vendor would have to implement it, and use that as a basis to configure it. I do know the free 5GC, if you do a change in the configuration, it will restart. But so I think then the machinery is available, the implementation of that specific instance is not supporting dynamic change. It supports dynamic change of configuration, but it's an immutable element, so it will restart with the new parameters. So every time you do a change, which you restart that element, that's basically how free 5GC works at the moment. And that's depending on your implementation. So if you build an operator that receives a new config that is able to handle that, in that case, you will not have that. So there is, so a part is related to free 5GC, Sana, to make it short.
Then that input would be perfect. Whenever you can do that, please do it in this document, and then update the SIG architecture group by giving us a reminder that you have inserted those gaps into this document. So you have promised to give us two things, the gaps in R1, which will help us brainstorm on what more can be done in R2, and the working of R1, if we apply that to some other vendor's network function, the mechanism, which you promised that you will do in the next session, right?
Yeah.
And these are both excellent inputs. Thank you so much. Okay, Wim, you have any other inputs?
No, that's it. Sorry, I will lower my hand.
Amazing. Thank you so much for both of these inputs. It would be very, very helpful. Any other raised hands here?
I think Kaushik is.
Yeah, okay, I can go. So maybe this is something, this is my proposal, right? There will be a main track, there'll be a proof of concepts, right? For the main track, given free 5GC is a very minimalistic network function, it doesn't really exercise with respect to network specific or NF specific infrastructure provisioning. It doesn't really do more complex things. So I think picking a real vendor and ideally maybe a cloud native, like I know Casa is not here, but somebody like Casa, extremely cloud native, they build operators and so forth, much easier to integrate. But I think a real world NF vendor would be extremely important. But the reason I'm saying that is pick a real vendor, pick maybe AMF, SMF, UPF, the same set of NFs that we had for R1, but then couple that with RAN, maybe a CUDU, maybe a VRAN, however easy or difficult between VRAN and ORAN. But then pick across core and RAN, pick one day 0, one day 1, and day 2 to n scenarios, right? Like just one user journey each in each of these. I think that's the main track. It's a relatively tractable track given 3.5, 4 months of work ahead of us. And then everything else in terms of Helm charts and using operator SDK to onboard the second NF vendor, those are all, I think, side tracks or, stretch goals, whatever you want to call it. And then there'll be POCs that we could run for Tosca integration and like whatever else, right? Like those shouldn't be conflated with the main track. And we should resource the main track.
To everything.
We should resource the main track. The reason I'm trying to delineate the main track from side tracks is we should resource the main track to drive completion for R2 by end of this year, right? Mid-November with some buffer for delays and so forth. So that is again my proposal for this group to think about. Just keep it simple. Don't worry about service orchestration. Don't worry about all of the other inventory management. All of those could be stretch goals. For the main track, just keep it simple. Just do day 0, 1 to very basic scenarios for core plus RAN, preferably with a cloud native NF vendor.
Yeah, Kaushik, I completely agree with you. The reason I also want to bring the production vendor is that even the deployment and configuration of a production grade NF is going to give us a lot more insights and challenges than how we experience that in the free 5GC. If I look at the CRDs that we developed for a vendor X, in our 5G core, they are extensive, like 20 plus CRDs for one network function. That's coming from my own personal experience. I have a feeling that they're a lot more complex. So if you look at that, if you look at CASA, for example, if that's in your mind, or Mavinair, or any other participating vendor who would like to offer their 5G core for this exercise, I think would be even the deployment and day 0, day 1 would have a lot more complexity to overcome than how we experience that in the free 5GC. And then if you also want to introduce the RAN VDU VCU, I think the bigger challenge around that, I would really like that idea, but the bigger challenge around that would be finding a vendor which could volunteer to offer their ORAN NF. And integration of a UPF to the ORAN is a classical use case that we are already working on in production right now. So it's very relevant to our context, TELUS context. It's very useful for us in the short term. But I'm thinking, let's get more feedback from the community on what they feel about this main track. Let's talk about the main track and see how we converge on that idea. I'm fully on board with this proposal. I'm just saying, how do we find the right vendors to basically volunteer their NFs and be able to share that information with the community and be able to make them the next use case.
I think Ravi is next.
Yes. So Sana, I was trying to understand your question. I mean, I think you're kind of referring. I mean, you are basically saying exactly how do we use the artifacts that was developed for R1 into R2, and I think there is a lack of clarity. I mean, I just want to kind of make this comment that I think the approach has to be a little bit more organic, in the sense that, you know, the first line that you say, okay, document the network architecture of the nephew. So I think that blueprint is definitely missing here, in the sense that a lot of the work that was done for release 1, I would think, was day 0. Like, you know, we did cluster management, cluster provisioning, or specialization for certain network functions and so on. But exactly, you know, at the network architecture level, what were those subsystems that took part, or how those subsystems interacted to achieve those use cases, is completely missing. So once, I think it's important to kind of identify these use cases and then make the architecture extensible, in the sense that then you say that, okay, I'm introducing this policy subsystem, I'm introducing an observability, I'm introducing a closed loop automation, and then you introduce new use cases and then reuse those subsystems to kind of, you know, to realize those use cases. I mean, this is a template that's kind of in standard that is followed in any forum, whether it's ORAN or HCNFP or anything like that, right? Because right now I feel that disconnect, and hence we are not able to kind of build that roadmap, because you don't have, nobody has that concrete kind of an architecture in mind and the subsystems in mind, or the use cases in mind, and how it was realized in R1. So I think that number 1 is a very important piece that we have to address, and at least document those use cases. Because even in R1, we said it was just like, okay, we had just had very high level views of saying that, okay, we want to have ABC scaling and all, but exactly how they were realized, I don't think everybody has a view in that mind. And so that was my comment in that document too earlier, to kind of have that in place, spend some time, have that in place, derive concrete use cases, make the architecture extensible, and then you have derive that roadmap, exactly what was achieved in R1, what will be R2 and R2 plus, and so on.
Valid point, Ravi. We will work on consolidating the document, refining that, coming up with an architecture and design, and then kind of building an incremental roadmap that just not give us a snapshot of R2, but could also show us some future steps on how the evolution of various swim lanes is gradually going to happen. It's something on my mind, but I think we are at a stage where we are gathering all the data points to be able to construct that. And I personally feel that when we are working on something like this, like in an open source project, we need to bring the whole community, gather all the inputs, converge on the ideas that collectively we are all presenting and thinking, and then trying to come up with something. I think is the biggest challenge in how we are like working on an open source project, right? So one of the reasons things got delayed is this reason. If it were an exercise where myself and Kaushik could just whiteboard and sit independently and develop something and just come out with a document, I think would have been much easier to do that. But I think we are working through everyone's thought process along the way to be able to come up with something that reflects the community's thinking behind that. So eventually, I'm hoping we will be able to accomplish that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I mean,
it
so
is
that
a high
roadmap, I just
priority.
said, exactly the roadmap that you mentioned is very important. Otherwise,
Right,
you wouldn't be
right.
able to.
So otherwise, we can't see
and,
the evolution or the steps or the progress. Like we can't see any of that.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Right. Fully agreed.
Okay, I believe I was the next.
Yes,
from our side, we've got a very specific ask. We have been evaluating and experimenting with Nephew a bit, also in our internal projects. And what we notice is that the notion of really properly describing infrastructure capabilities, infrastructure profiles, and aligning them sort of with the CIQ requirements is something which is still sort of a little bit of guessworking of how to do that properly. So ideally, there would be an automated process. Given a certain CIQ structure, we could derive out of that sort of the declarations which need to be sort of put into our configuration files for processing via Nephew. And here, sort of, it would be great to come up with a procedure of how this onboarding of network functions, given a certain CIQ, would allow us then to structure this setup of the pipeline.
Bernard, it's a very valid focus area. We are currently in a very similar situation. We are working on deployment of the 5G core, and the infrastructure automation and infrastructure automation management is something we are tackling through automation of the full CIQs, through exposing our networks and our IPAM, through internal inventory systems, and exposing that as a YAML file. And we're trying to consume the YAML file inside our automation templates for infrastructure as code, as well as the NSDs that we are developing for that. So you are looking at something that they tried to touch in the R1 as well, but you're trying to basically propose that we should extend on that and automate more, like the full CIQ execution in the configuration management should become a part of scope for the R2, right?
So taking into account potentially different hardware environments, which might require also different configurations. Yeah, so what we notice is that when we are sort of going through the evolution of different cloud environments, that sort of applying sort of these Nephew concepts led to certain hacks which we introduced, and we would like to have a more structured way of how we would account for different configuration and profiles of the infrastructure.
And we are basically, through this exercise, we are proposing a model in the industry that if you have to go through the process, how would you use a very cloud native approach in executing that part? Because I believe if we are working on Google Cloud right now, or if you're working on Red Hat, I'm just speaking from the community members that are actually present on our forum very actively. If we try to show it in a couple of clouds, or maybe one of these clouds, it would not be as is used for another heterogeneous cloud, but at least we need to bring some heterogeneity in the infrastructure side so that we could bring some generic models out of it.
Yeah, but just to mention also, yeah, I agree. I fully agree. I just wanted to mention that even within sort of the same sort of infrastructure provider domain, we noticed that sort of the configurations changed and that there are issues sort of making sort of one deployment procedure work compared to another setup. So I believe that this is a general issue, and this really consumes a lot of time when setting up or onboarding any kind of network function onto our cloud environments.
So Ben, I'm sorry to jump the line, if I may ask. the change of the profile, what does the profile represent in that case? Is it a different server or something like that, or the server hardware?
Different servers, network configurations, capabilities which are available in the environment, and so on. Yes. So
so maybe that's another thing. I mean, we did something in R1, by the way, for this, not complete, but I'm actually working on improving that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I will show you a demo in 2 weeks, and you will have. So what that does is a full inventory system with models of a specific implementation. So in other words, you could say I have this, and then the question is, what are all the parameters that are in there? But for example, you can model a server with, at the moment, we are mainly focused on the connectivity because that's what we have in R1, basically. But you can have a server, you can say, I have 2 NICs, I have 4 NICs, and we can have other parameters going forward. But so that's, so I can show you a demo of what is in R1 and the enhancements that we are doing.
Very good. So why I'm asking that is, I simply would like to have a structured process where I say, if I go through this checklist of activities, then sort of we can sort of come up with a clear estimation of how we sort of set up this environment in a sort of well-defined amount of time. Currently, it's always guest working and a lot of discussions going on to and sort of back and forth, and that's what I want to get rid of. I want to have a clear procedure in place where we say this is how you do it, and then based on that we can estimate the sort of implementation times and optimize that and automate that over the time.
Yeah. But we'll show you what we have, and then we have to see what we have to improve, right? So
very good.
What I'm trying to say is we have something, and then the question is it good enough, or what needs to be enhanced onto it? Yeah. Okay.
So I have another question to you, Bernard, to be able to understand your ask more clearly. So when you're talking about the site-to-site deployment and all the changes in the CIQs and the configurations, is that related to the networking of your specific architecture, or you're more talking about the network function level changes that we have to apply from going from site to site? Like, which level are you on when you're talking about that?
Yeah, so what we noticed is that we came up with a CIQ, we said we've got the same network function, and then we had to change the hardware profile, and nothing worked any longer. And we had to sort of rewire the configuration. And this process of understanding how we adapt that and how we account for different hardware profiles sort of is something where we wouldn't want to sort of have to do this everybody sitting together and we then sort of come up with a conclusion of how to solve a certain issue in the configuration, but rather have a sort of well-defined process saying, given a CIQ, given a hardware profile, based on that we can derive the nephew configurations and then sort of establish the pipeline.
Right. That's a good input. And I'm assuming that there is some degree of heterogeneity in your infrastructure environments as well, going from one place to the other. Yes. When the CIQ, not just the CIQ itself, but the template also changes when you go from a one kind of environment to a relatively different kind of environment. Yes. And then you have to go into a questions with the vendor again to be able to ask the right questions and be able to come up with another right set of template for a new environment that would reflect the requirements on that. And the vendor would not have tested their network function on the kind of environment that you have. So basically, it's always a brand new work for the vendor to come in and learn about your architecture, your networking, your profiles, and then identify his requirements. And so every time development of the CIQ is a brand new effort. What you are basically targeting at, Bernard, I think there was about this particular pain point and about this challenge a couple of years ago. I think CNTT was trying to generalize and basically try to make the infrastructure types a little bit more common and standardized rather than truly heterogeneous. I think that was something that they were trying to approach to solve this particular problem in that way, which could reduce the pain that we experience in that kind of a situation. So I see what you're saying. We have relatively, probably slightly better experience right now with this particular problem in TELUS is that we have fully standardized environments all around. So basically, the CIQ parameters change, but the CIQ template is exactly identical across all our regions, across all of our clouds. So in our pipelines, we use inventory to basically fetch the right parameters every time, and we tweak our CIQ automation, and then we absorb that into our infrastructure pipeline, and we are currently doing it that way. I'm not saying it's a pain-free process at the moment. It still takes time, but I think our back and forth to vendors have slightly reduced than how it was in the beginning, like when we started working on the initial deployment.
So any improvement on a community basis here would definitely be highly appreciated, so that the adoption rate also by the infrastructure providers as well as by the network function vendors is higher. Yeah, so because we've also got some of our standard templates, but sort of we nevertheless have to then explain to the parties sort of what we believe is important, and then sort of there's still a lot of discussion going on. So if you could have a community understanding, it would be great.
That's amazing. So I think we can keep one of that as a focus areas, that we have heterogeneous environments. How do we come up with a framework that facilitates the deployment of the infrastructure automation and automate the CIQ in that process for us? And what is a model that we should follow and use that could guide the community around certain best practices as well? Like even the vendors community, how can they come up with information that is actually reflective of the heterogeneous infrastructure environments across the board? Because probably that's something that requires a little bit of optimization.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
Great. It seems like I'm the next on the queue. So probably I'm going to keep in the same theme about Nephew adoption. So the only thing that I was thinking is about like kind of like a win-win situation. I know that in the past, especially Anuket, ONAP, and OpenNFT, they have created like a mechanism to recognize the efforts of the CNF vendors or and applying all these community best practices. So they have created like certification programs. I don't know if that could be something that we can also adapt it, like in order to encourage others to try to explore a Nephew and you know, like reporting the results, and also encourage others to also participate, because if we want to try to convince especially vendors to experiment, they are going to be waiting for others to also participate. So it's like it's going to create like a mutex like a deadlock mutex situation where everyone is waiting for anyone, right? So I don't know if we can use a similar approach. Maybe I'm not sure if certification is like the right way to encourage anyone to try to get the certification, but at least like try to find like a mechanism to encourage NF vendors to participate in this project.
I guess I'm next.
Go ahead.
My concern is there are only 3 months until November, right? August, September, October. R2 right now, even if we stick to the main path that Kaushik has suggested, is still very large. And I'm not so sure how to map this group, the SIG1 group, to what can be delivered, right? I know right now we're brainstorming and everything's included and we'll narrow it down, but I kind of want to keep the brainstorming to something that can be delivered. And given, you know, haven't gone through R1 development, automation, coding, all that, it was not easy. It was not well paced, right? We did a lot of work in a short amount of time. So please keep that in mind when you scoping R2.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a valid point. I think with this community, we'll come up with something that is of high priority to what everybody's working on right now. We'll have a lot of discussions back and forth with SIG automation. So for example, if we develop some proposal and we have certain use cases, we would go into a discussion mode with SIG automation. And then together we can identify, okay, this is doable. This looks great, but I think we can't do it in 3 months. And then we'll consolidate to what R2 scope really is going to look like. So I think you're right, but we are just trying to help SIG automation understand the priorities coming out of this particular community.
Yeah, and one thing I've been wondering, and I've talked to John about this, and Stephen and Vim and other SIG automation people team, but I'm not so sure if it's SIG automation or SIG network architecture, which is the overall architecture. You know, right now we have it here and there, but it's not documented, it's not laid down somewhere, right? And I don't know which group is. So I like that idea that we have an overall architecture and then roadmap, corresponding roadmap, or vice versa to guide us. That's it. Thanks.
Good. Thanks. As said, we are working on it. It's a holistic session, working with everyone's thought process. So we'll converge at that, and we will produce that documentation, architecture, our roadmap towards the end of our sessions. And that's what we are targeting, myself and Kaushik, to produce at the end of all this working exercise session.
Yeah, if I may jump the queue, I think Antho, your inputs are extremely valid about looking at the timeline and so forth. What we should do in terms of the requirements is, even on the main track, for each of the user journeys, we should put some priorities, right? And then based on, I'm sure beyond the user journeys and functional or scale requirements, SIG2 would want to make improvements to the infrastructure and so forth, which we don't know exactly in what shape and form factor. So based on all of those inputs, we'll need to then pick based on what the priorities are. So what we're describing here as the main track is desirable, but then the realities will need to then reflect which user journeys within the main track will end up getting prioritized in what form factor.
Agree. SIG2 has been talking about tech depths that we'd like to solve for R2. And roughly off the top of my head, putting on my product management hat, it's about 50% of our time already. It's going to be 50-50, new feature versus tech depth for R2. So keep that in mind. It's a rough number.
Yeah, I think it's Wimmy and maybe, yeah, but it's like Sana and Kaushik said, we have to collectively agree on the content on R2, right? And we have to, so we are also doing that, but you're right, is that the timing is not long, so the budget is going to be probably smaller, and then we have to, that's the exercise we are doing right now. So hopefully we can conclude sooner than later, and then we can go and start working on that, on achieving that, right?
Yep. Thank you.
But it's very valid concern. Don't get me wrong.
And
because I don't want to stay up till 2 a.m. coding. That's all.
Yeah. Hey, another thing we should do is, for anything with strict dependencies like a real NF vendor or a infra vendor, we should have a backup plan. If by certain timelines we are not able to, get alignment with those vendors or get a lab set up and so forth, we need to have a very clearly articulated execution plan with backups.
I agree, Kaushik. So when we propose our R2 use cases, we should say, this is the plan A. If the plan B falls, if the plan B doesn't work out because of these identified risks, let's roll back to plan B. And plan B should be extension of our existing pre-5GC by doing something more ambitious on the top, so that at least the work can keep progressing. And the exercise of identifying the vendors who would volunteer for their network functions should start right now. Let's just see who would volunteer. Maybe that discussion is not just SIG architecture, it's holistically from Nephew project leaders. We can identify the volunteers who would actually be happy to offer their network functions, the commercial grade network functions for this exercise. Basically, we should do this in parallel.
I agree, Sana. So I will take the point to Nokia, but my opinion is not necessarily the company opinions, right? So
I know
that's the challenge sometimes.
If it were, and if it gets Vim, Nokia is going to be very advanced and lucky, following your visions and insights, because you're coming out of Nephew.
For sure, but yeah.
I know.
Yeah, but other thing is also one question is, if you were to take a network function vendor, the vendor has a certain implementation, then you're basically saying that you have to bend your architecture also to that implementation, right? How are we going to kind of align these two? Because your architecture should be kind of independent of an implementation. I mean,
I think that's
forums don't define don't necessitate that I need an implementation to define the architecture.
No, but I think whether I agree that we need to have a more a vendor implementation is that I think 3.5GC is limited to in the way it is architected, right? So we want to see what are all the other parameters that we would need to consume. And that would be the input. Now, our implementation, I mean, we have to architect it in such a way that you are not stuck to that implementation, right? So that is then, I think, the job we have to do is build a framework around an implementation that is not necessarily specific to that implementation.
Exactly, that's what my point. As long as we keep that as the North Star, I mean, I think that is the main important.
Yeah, that's not always easy, because you will become biased to certain things, but we need to be, it's a very valid point. You have to build it in such a way that it's vendor agnostic, or should become vendor agnostic. But yeah, because you will become biased to certain things. But for example, if you look, for example, what we did for the 3.5GC, I can already tell you right now that the infrastructure related components we can reuse 100% for Nokia. You see?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I understand that, but
there will be other pieces. There will be other pieces that are not yet modeled.
Yeah, exactly. There'll be a lot more other dependencies. So.
Correct. So what I'm trying to say is that what we did for R1 is reusable, is what I'm trying to say. There will be other pieces which we have to do that exercise still. So I just wanted to say that I think what we try to do in R1, although we did use 3.5GC, at least I always try to build it in a way that it was agnostic of 3.5GC. You see?
No, what I'm saying that kind of the that kind of a vision and guideline and direction should come from this group as well. That's what I'm just trying to kind of delineate that. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
100%, yeah.
And obviously we would want more vendor participations. If you're worried that we are narrowed down into just one vendor, more vendors jumping in would be great.
I was noting down, I don't know if there are more raised hands. Or do we have any raised hands? Okay, Joseph. We'll finish his, and then we go to the next.
Yeah, so Joseph here. So based on the discussions, I think Kaushik had mentioned, right, the main track and the side tracks. So I think the main track, I think what I understood is mainly to be with the use of real world and CNF for both RAN and core, and try to demonstrate maybe a deployment using Nephew. I think I think that's what I understood from the discussions. And the side tracks are, the side tracks are mainly to show some kind of POCs to demonstrate the use of Nephew. I mean, is that the backup plan? And should we look at, so right now we have 3.5GC, but should we look at a RAN similar open source for that side tracks or backup, so that we can also show an end-to-end call
Yeah.
using Nephew deployment using Nephew, while we get real-world CNF for RAN and core.
Right, Joseph. I was thinking on that in parallel. Either we could have the open source 5G, like the way we have this free 5GC, and connect that to an open source ORAN components. I know there are multiple open source ORAN that we can experiment and play with, and the Helm charts would be open, and we could demo some of the work in this. Or we can have a commercial 5G core connecting with an open source ORAN, or we can have both commercial. Going down, commercial is going to be a lot more ambitious and meaningful to the community and industry, and it's going to basically excite other vendors in the community to bring their network functions and adopt that model as well. So from the Nephew project success point of view, I personally feel, I'm not a vendor, so I personally feel that if any of the vendors can actually demonstrate the Nephew-based deployment, I would have a much higher confidence in using Nephew, being a service provider. So the ideal is having a commercial instance, because we will not be staying like in a learning and experimenting stage. We would need to bring Nephew to the point where we can actually use that for production deployments in our networks. So that's an ideal situation, but of course, we can only do what we can do in R2. So we'll see where we are, but I'm just sharing my preferences with you. If it is a commercial network function, would actually be a higher complexity, more sophisticated work around that, and actually be more powerful in that demo to show the community that this can actually be done and can be adopted in the short term as well.
Okay, yeah, understood. But in this case, do you expect the NF vendors also to provide the operators, develop the operators also, so that it can be developed using the Nephew framework, or will Nephew community develop operators so that it, the vendor CNF can be deployed, because it would be a lot more complicated.
I think I'm doing very similar POCs currently with external vendors, and we are asking those vendors to we are writing basically a contract with those vendors, and we are asking them to share your Helm charts and share the information around the Helm charts that is actually required for building the corresponding operator. If a vendor agrees to just that, and if they are not familiar with the process of writing an operator and everything, we are trying to do that ourselves and in-house and through the Nephew project groups to be able to accomplish that. So basically, it's a joint effort by the vendor and the community which supports Nephew project to accomplish that. So it's just that. It would not be a support of giving you full operator by that vendor.
But Hannah, that was my point. Like we have to some way to recompense, say, those vendors to taking that initiative to participate in this effort. So we have to find a way to
Victor, what is the incentive? What is the incentive with those vendors? So basically, we are just emerging out in a community from a state that people are just realizing, okay, this is useful, this is good. A lot of the work that we are doing in Nephew is kind of different than how we have been working before. So for example, in most of the vendors' products, when they became CNFs, they were working with pure Helm charts, and which was a milestone for them to accomplish a good quality Helm chart as well. So the vendors would not have an incentive that since the Helm charts are just started working and it's some degree of automation, why do I have to write the operator? So I was
the compensation that I was thinking is just maybe a single batch, like somewhere where we can publish and say, well, all these vendors has been proof that their products are working with Nephew, and maybe that's the only thing, like have a single page where we can list all of the CNF vendors as minimal as that. Like I'm not thinking about any other kind of reward.
That's a very good idea. I think it goes beyond the scope of SIG architecture to think through. Maybe I'll discuss that with Kandan and see what we can do at the TSC level to bring out this kind of a proposal and create that incentive in vendors to be able to volunteer and participate in the project. It's a great idea, Victor. I think we'll focus on that and see how we can make progress.
So
And
Sana,
especially, go
so
ahead,
just
Tim.
maybe quick is like what I see at the moment, what
Mm.
I'm doing is because I have the license of this thing. So when I said I'm documenting that, so what I'm doing in the first thing without, so which we as a vendor can, what you can do as a vendor without yet exposing your network function is you can try to prove the onboarding. So what I'm doing, what I was set for next week Tuesday is documenting how I did it. So that's for me the first step, right? And making
Excellent.
that public. So making that public and doing it in a way that is not Nokia specific at the end of the day. So that was one thing. So that at least we start that process, and then first step could be that Samsung and Ericsson and Mavenir and Casa by themselves, without yet exposing their network function to us, would do that and document that. So that would be step number one, that we get endorsement. Step number two is, of course, that they would give that network function to the Nephew community such that they can test and validate that independent of the vendor itself, right? So that I see even two phases in this whole journey. The other thing that I wanted to mention is which is for networking, right, in R1. So we are doing a bit of networking. There is the official Nokia device is actually there, but that's an image which is unlicensed, so it's free for everybody to use. So even in R1, there is actually a Nokia element, which is not a network function, but a networking element that is being used to actually set up the whole network configuration. So that would be the same as our commercial implementation. So we are already,
perfect.
so we are using some, I would say a commercial implementation in the networking side. But that's not a network function, just to be clear.
That's perfect, Wim. Wim, I'll circle back with you offline just to explore which network functions are you experimenting within Nokia, and if there are any network functions that are of TELUS context. So I'll explore that with you offline and see if there's something that we can do with you directly.
Okay.
Awesome.
Hey, so we are almost at time. How do we do this? As in, it's great we kind of somewhat agreed on the main track and so forth, but I saw Sana, you and Bernard are starting to document some of your things. How do we, like, in terms of user journeys themselves, right? The user stories. Do you, Sana, you and Bernard want to kind of, as a customer, from a customer viewpoint, you want to take the lead? Or would you like all of us to then add our inputs in the doc and we go over each user story added by each of us and then review them? Like, what would, we need to converge very quickly, but I also don't want to exclude people. So we should figure out some middle ground here.
Kaushik, I think I will invite the whole community to come in and include the proposal on the user journeys, and then we come together to basically filter out or basically converge that input. I'm definitely going to insert my ideas there, and in one of the future working sessions, we can review all the inputs and then we can consolidate that to finalize the R2 user journeys.
Okay, so but then we will request the user input, meaning the community input for the main track primary, and we'll define what the main track is, and we'll say within this track, come up with the user journeys. And then for side tracks or additional tracks, those can be anything that people are willing to contribute and so forth, as long as it doesn't kind of affect the main track.
Perfect. Are we aligned on the main track? Like, what is the outcome of today's meeting? Are we all feeling confident that this particular model, a 5G core connecting with the ORAN function and showing a demo of the configuration between them would be something very useful for our next milestone? Like on a very high level, are we aligned on that?
I would yeah, agree with that approach, because towards your point, Sana, is we have to make Nephew work in production, right? So at the moment, I don't think R1 is probably usable in production as of now, right? So
Yeah.
for me, that should always be the we have the same inside of Nokia. Sometimes you can jump on everything onto the planet and don't do everything but nothing well, right? And then you're a jack of all trades, but you are not really seen as the good guy because you do everything but nothing well, and nobody's can use you in production. So I'm of the opinion that it's better to focus and make something really carrier grade at the end of the day, and then focus on the next thing. And that doesn't mean that you have to do them 100% sequential, because some of the things I look at it the following way. If you look why we could do what we did in R1, because we did the demo in the one summit, right? So we kind of had our prototype, if you will, from which we learned. So that doesn't mean that some of the other elements like integrating with service orchestration and something like that, we could not do, but maybe it's not really a deliverable, but it could be a deliverable for experimentation and sharing knowledge to then try to get a better understanding of what needs to happen, because you have to, like Antu said, right? We have 3 months basically. And if you never, or if certain people don't have the experience and they have to get used to it and understand it and all of that, and then do a deliverable in 3 months, I think it's impossible. So I'm more of the approach that we have a few strategic topics that we want to start getting towards, maybe into R3 as a real thing. So we could potentially set aside a set of resources that are going to experiment with those type of things, gain the knowledge, share the knowledge, and then see where that we would fit that into the release, but focus the next one to make what we have right now more carrier grade. Maybe that's not the right term, but yeah, that's how I see it.
Absolutely. I think we should request inputs from the community. If we're aligned on the track, we should request inputs from the community on what we can do on this main track. Like what are the use cases that we want to basically show on the main track. In parallel, we'll continue to work on the possibilities of which permutation of this main track could become feasible for us. I tried to put priorities of preferences on these permutations, but I was feeling that if it's both commercial is very ambitious, we may or may not be able to accomplish that, but let's just see where we land with that. But I think at this point, we are requesting for inputs from the community on the use cases, given that this is the main track. And if we are converged on that idea, we could show further. For example, Bernard really wanted us to focus on the infrastructure configurations with the heterogeneous environments. How do we automate the CIQ, and how do we present a model to the community that actually accelerate the deployment from site to site? Like, he's struggling with that internally within his organization, and he wants more standardization in the framework and how we can derive some of the work through Nephew. This is an idea. This is a focus. We would apply that to basically the context of the main track that Kaushik initially recommended. Similarly, we need inputs from everyone on the main track. What else do we want to do with that? Like, to which degree we're showing the deployment, we're showing the configurations, we can show the initial configurations between the 5G core and the RAN. To what degree are we accomplishing the lifecycle management? To what degree we are showing the configurations? Let's just dump our ideas there. What we can accomplish out of that in the 3 months target is an exercise that we will do with the SIG automation. Once we submit the proposal to them, we'll review with them and we'll explore what is feasible for them, what is not, and then we'll arrive at the right scope for R2 eventually. But before we meet again in the next session, anyone who has inputs or ideas to basically prescribe their recommendations on a given track, please do that. I will spend some time and I will propose some ideas from myself as well as the parallel POCs on the tracks that Kaushik mentioned. If you have ideas on that, feel free to add that as well. And we'll publish this document link in the SIG architecture so that everyone has access to that. I'm sure Kaushik has already opened that.
Yeah, I think hopefully everyone should have access.
Perfect. Kaushik, are you good with the next steps? We expect some inputs from the community, and in the next session, we will at least have some things to basically go through and converge the document.
Yeah, Sana, can you maybe publish the timeline also when you open it up to the community and say, hey, we really need to make fast progress and please add your inputs by whatever date, right? So that are we meeting Monday, first of all, in SIG1 on a weekly basis now before
Yes,
R2 closure?
I'm good with that.
Right. So then today, tomorrow, 2 days, we have we open it up to the community, request urgent kind of inputs from them, and then Monday we meet to review.
Perfect. And if we don't have a lot of inputs by Monday, we could extend that until like coming Thursday. But Thursday should be the final date for us to basically converge on all the documents and clean up the user journeys for R2.
Yeah.
The sooner we share that with the SIG automation, the sooner we can converge on the final scope of R2, and they would have something concrete to work on. So next week, we have 3 meetings, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, on the various working groups, and we'll be working on the same document to basically complete the R2 requirements for SIG automation. And by the end of next week, hopefully we'll have something concrete to present to SIG automation. I think we can wrap up the meeting now. Most of the people are already leaving.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Just bookkeeping wise, I will be out on vacation August 1st to 16th. Unfortunately, it is in the thick of the moment. I was hoping we would have closed on R2 much before that, but it is what it is. So Sana, I'll lean on you to conduct the meetings during this time. I will of course be available offline if you need for document reviews and so forth, but meetings might be a little bit tricky for me given my travel.
All good, Kaushik. Kaushik, by next Thursday, we'll consolidate on our inputs and we will share that with SIG automation. And I think the discussions with SIG automation will happen over the course of a couple of weeks to be able to converge on what we are able to accomplish. So by the time you're back, I think we'll be in a stage of discussions with SIG automation.
Cool. Sounds like a plan.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.